The morning Nora Callahan buried her sister, the man who owned the debt came to collect. She hadn't finished pinning her mourning dress when she heard boots on the porch steps, heavy, deliberate, the kind of steps that expected doors to open before they knocked. She smoothed the black wool over her hips and went to meet him anyway, because she'd learned early that men like Harlan Voss didn't wait for permission and got meaner when they thought you were hiding. He stood in the doorway with his hat in one hand and a folded paper in the other, and his expression had the practiced sorrow of a man who'd delivered bad news so many times it had stopped costing him anything. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, though she'd been Miss Callahan for the 3 years since her husband walked into a river in Missouri and didn't walk out. "Old habits. I'm sorry about your sister." "No, you're not," Nora said. "What's the paper?" He handed it over without argument. Harlan Voss was many things, but he wasn't a man who pretended to be offended when the pretense cost him time. The paper was a promissory note. Iris had signed it 8 months ago, borrowing $400 against the boarding house she'd run since their mother died. Nora read it twice, then a third time, waiting for the numbers to shift into something survivable. They didn't. $400, plus interest compounded monthly, plus the clause at the bottom that said in the event of default the property would revert to the lender in full. "She never told me," Nora said. People don't, generally, when they're ashamed. Voss took the paper back with the efficiency of a man who'd never intended to leave it with her. "You have 30 days. After that, I'll need the premises vacated." Nora stood in the doorway of the boarding house where she'd spent the last year helping Iris manage laundry and meals and the particular arithmetic of making ends meet in a Wyoming cattle town, and she watched Harlan Voss walk back to his horse, and she did not cry. She'd used up her crying at the churchyard an hour ago and didn't have anything left. 30 days. She went inside and sat at Iris's kitchen table and looked at the account books her sister had kept, and the numbers told her everything she'd been too busy grieving to see. The boarding house hadn't been profitable in 2 years. Iris had been borrowing against the future to fund the present, and the future had run out before Iris did. Nora was 31 years old with $11, a decent hand with numbers, and no particular place to go. The newspaper was on the table because Iris had saved newspapers. Nora didn't read it so much as let her eyes drift across it while she tried to think. She almost missed the advertisement entirely. It was small, tucked between a notice for a missing bay mare and an announcement about the new schoolhouse in Cutter's Creek. Wanted. Capable woman for housekeeping and child management on working cattle ranch. References preferred but situation urgent. Apply to R. Whitmore, Dry Fork, Wyoming Territory. She read it 4 times. Then she folded the newspaper and put it in her pocket and started writing a letter. Because $11 wouldn't last 30 days and she'd be damned if she'd spend them waiting for something better to appear. R. Whitmore turned out to be Rance Whitmore, and Dry Fork turned out to be a 3-hour wagon ride from the nearest town that had a telegraph office. His reply came in 6 days, which was fast enough that she suspected he'd had other applicants and something about hers had ended the search. He offered room and board and $12 a month, which was not generous but was honest. And he mentioned in a postscript that there were 2 children, ages 6 and 9, and that the situation was indeed urgent, which she was beginning to understand was his way of saying, "Please hurry." She arrived on a Tuesday in late October with 1 trunk and the account books she'd taken from Iris's kitchen because it seemed wrong to leave them. The wagon that picked her up at the Dry Fork crossroads was driven by a hand named Ott, who was approximately 70 years old and had the conversational habits of a man who'd spent most of his life talking to cattle. "House needs work," he said 3 miles in. "What kind?" "All kinds." That was the entire conversation until they pulled up to the Whitmore Ranch, which was a long, low structure that had clearly been built in stages by people with different priorities. The main house was solid enough, but the porch sagged on one end, and 2 of the front windows had cracked panes patched with oilcloth. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her something about Rance Whitmore before she'd met him. He was standing by the corral when they arrived, and he looked up when the wagon stopped. Nora had expected someone soft gone to seed or someone old gone to bitterness. Instead, Rance Whitmore was somewhere in his late 30s, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of face that had probably been pleasant before something had worked the pleasant out of it. He looked at her the way men who've been disappointed look at most things, not with hostility exactly, but with a careful absence of hope. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." He didn't offer to help with her trunk. She didn't wait for him to. She picked up her end and nodded to Ott, who took the other, and they carried it inside while Rance held the door. The house was cleaner than she'd feared and emptier than she'd expected. Someone had been keeping the floors swept and the dishes washed, but there were no curtains on the windows and no rugs on the floors. and the walls had the bare, temporary look of a place no one had decided to stay in yet, or a place someone had left. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, setting her end of the trunk down in the room he indicated. It wasn't a question. 3 years ago, he said. "Fever, I'm sorry. The children are at school. They'll be back by 4. He paused in the doorway. "The boy is 9. His name is Eli. He'll test you. Boys do. The girl is 6. Ada. Something shifted in his face for just a moment, so briefly she might have imagined it. "She doesn't talk much. She used to," and then she stopped. "The doctor in Cutter's Creek says there's nothing wrong with her that time won't fix." Nora thought about that. What happened 3 years ago, the fever? Did Ada see it? Rance looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were very dark and very tired. "Yes, then the doctor's probably right," Nora said. "About time." He nodded once, the way men who don't know what to do with kindness acknowledge it, and left her to unpack. The first week was about learning the shape of the place. The boarding house had taught her to read households the way she read account books, looking for where the spending stopped, where the effort fell short, what had been given up, and what was being held together with stubbornness and wire. The Whitmore ranch had been given up on in stages. The kitchen garden had gone to seed in the back. The root cellar had enough to get through winter, but barely. The mending basket overflowed with work that had been accumulating since long before Nora arrived, and Eli wore through the knees of every pair of trousers he owned, with what she suspected was deliberate efficiency. She mended the trousers. She replanted what she could in the garden before the frost finished it off. She found curtains in a trunk in the back room, folded and washed and smelling of cedar, and hung them in the kitchen and the children's room. She didn't ask permission. Rance said nothing about it except to look at the kitchen window one morning, as if seeing it for the first time. Eli tested her, as advertised. He hid her measuring cup and put a frog in the flour bin, and told her flatly that she wasn't as good a cook as his mama. She found the measuring cup, removed the frog without comment, and told him she hadn't claimed to be. He looked at her sideways after that, trying to decide whether she was worth further trouble. Ada watched everything. She'd trail into whatever room Nora was working in and stand in the corner, or sit on the floor and watch with enormous dark eyes that were very much her father's. She never asked for anything. She'd been taught not to, or had taught herself not to, and the lesson had gone too deep. On the 8th day, Nora sat down on the kitchen floor next to Ada. Not at the table, not looming above her, just sat down, and started shelling peas and didn't say a word. Ada watched her for 5 minutes. Then she picked up a pod and started shelling too. They did the whole bowl together in silence. That was the beginning. The trouble had a name, and the name was Gideon Voss. Harlan Voss's brother, as it turned out. Wyoming was not a large territory in the ways that mattered, and men with money and meanness in them tended to operate in overlapping circles. Nora didn't know about Gideon Voss until the 3rd week, when a man she didn't recognize rode up to the house on a Tuesday afternoon while Rance was out on the range. He was older than Harlan, broader, with a way of sitting his horse that said he was used to arriving places and finding them rearranged to his liking. "You must be the new housekeeper," he said from horseback, not bothering to dismount. "Voss? Gideon Voss. I have business with Whitmore." "He's not here," Nora said. "I can tell him you called." "You do that." He looked at the house, the barn, the corral, the way a man looks at property he's already calculating. "Tell him the loan's due at the end of next month. Full amount, not installments." After he left, Nora went to the desk in Rance's study, where she'd organized the papers in the first week because chaos in account books was something she couldn't leave alone. She found the loan document in the 3rd drawer. $2,000 borrowed 18 months ago against the eastern pasture. The terms were not predatory on their face, but the balloon clause at the end meant the full amount came due in one payment, and the payment date was 6 weeks away. She was still sitting there with the paper in her hands when Rance came in from the range. He saw her face before he saw what she was holding, and something in him went very still. "You know about the Voss loan," she said. "Yes. $2,000 in 6 weeks. Yes, and the eastern pasture is your best grazing land. It's the only grazing land worth a damn." He sat down across from her, and he looked so tired that she wanted to look away. "Gideon came by?" He said full amount, not installments. Rance nodded like this was what he'd been expecting and had been dreading expecting it. "He's been buying up land south of here. Needs the water rights that come with the eastern pasture. If I lose the pasture, I lose the water rights. And without the water rights, the cattle can't summer on the North Range." He rubbed his face. "Without the North Range, the ranch doesn't run." Nora set the paper down. How did this happen? Rebecca was sick for a long time before she died. Longer than people knew. He looked at his hands. "The doctors cost money. The medicine cost money. The year she died, I had a bad winter and lost 30 head. I needed the loan to get through to spring." He paused. "I didn't know who Gideon Voss was then." Not really. Do you know who he is now? He's bought out 4 ranches in the last 2 years. Same method every time. Loan with a balloon payment. Time to hit when money's short. When the rancher can't pay, he takes the land for less than it's worth and moves on to the next one. Rance looked up. I knew by the time I knew it didn't change anything. What does the sheriff say? Rance's mouth went flat. The sheriff in Cutter's Creek says private contracts are private contracts and he doesn't interfere in legal financial arrangements. Does the sheriff bank with Gideon Voss? A pause. I expect so. Nora sat back and looked at the loan document again. The numbers were what they were. She turned them in her head the way she'd turned the numbers in Iris's account books, looking for the angles. I need to see all of your accounts, she said. Everything. What you owe, what you're owed, what you can sell, what you can't afford to sell. Rance looked at her. Why? Because I'm good with numbers and you're clearly not, and you have 6 weeks, and that's not nothing. She met his eyes. Unless you've already given up. He hadn't given up. She could see it in the way the stillness in him shifted. Not hope, not yet, but the thing that comes before hope when you've been without it long enough that you've forgotten what it felt like. I haven't given up, he said quietly. Then show me the accounts. She worked through the accounts over 3 evenings at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, with Rance sitting across from her sometimes and sometimes not, answering questions when she had them and leaving her to it when she didn't. What she found was not good, but it was not hopeless, which was a distinction that mattered. There were 3 cattle buyers who owed Rance for a sale made in September, payment past due. There was timber on the western ridge he'd never harvested because he didn't have the manpower, but the lumber mill in Cutter's Creek was paying good prices. There was a strip of land on the north boundary that he owned outright, no liens, that a neighboring rancher named Cord had been wanting to buy for 2 years. None of it added up to $2,000. But it added up to $1,200, maybe $1,300, if she pressed the cattle buyers hard, and $1,200 was a different problem than $2,000. If you could get an extension on the remaining $800, she said, on the 3rd evening, show Voss you've paid down the principal significantly. Gideon Voss doesn't negotiate, Rance said. He waits. He waited because he thought you had nothing. He thought the land was already his. Nora tapped the paper. If you show up with $1,200 in cash, you change the calculation. A man who'd take a ranch doesn't necessarily turn down cash money in hand. Or he takes the cash and the ranch? Not if we structure it right. He looked at her. We? She caught herself. I meant, I can help draft the repayment proposal if you want. Rance was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind came down off the hills and moved through the grass with the sound of something being decided. Why are you helping me? He said. This isn't what I hired you for. It was a fair question. She owed him clean floors and well-fed children. She didn't owe him rescue. Because I watched my sister lose everything to a man exactly like Gideon Voss, she said, and I didn't know enough then to stop it. I know enough now. She straightened the papers. And because Eli and Ada didn't do anything to deserve losing this ranch, and they've already lost enough. Rance looked at her for a long moment. Not the careful, hopeless look he usually had, but something more open and more frightening, like a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone in his corner and was remembering it now at the worst possible time. All right, he said finally, show me. Gideon Voss arrived 3 weeks later with 2 men and an air of foregone conclusion. Rance met him in the yard. Nora stayed inside because Rance had asked her to, but she stood at the kitchen window where she could see and hear most of it, which was the same thing as staying inside and wasn't. She heard Rance offer $1,250 cash, to be paid that afternoon in exchange for a 60-day extension on the remaining balance, to be secured against the north boundary strip rather than the eastern pasture. She heard Gideon Voss say no. She heard Rance say that the timber on the western ridge was now under contract with the Cutter's Creek mill, which wasn't quite true, but wasn't quite a lie either, since she'd had Ott ride to the mill yesterday with a letter, and a letter sent was an offer made. She heard Voss pause. She went to the door then, because something in the pause felt like a hinge point, and she'd learned from the boarding house that hinge points needed witnesses. Mr. Voss, she said from the porch, I'm sorry to interrupt. The papers from the mill arrived this morning. Rance, do you want me to bring them out? There were no papers from the mill. She was betting that Gideon Voss didn't know that and wouldn't call the bluff in front of witnesses. Voss looked at her. She looked back. She'd learned from a life of difficult men that the kind who respected nothing still respected a woman who didn't flinch because it confused them. Keep your papers, Voss said. He looked back at Rance. 60 days. The North Strip as collateral, not the pasture. And I want the cash today. Not a promissory note. It'll take an hour to ride to the bank and back, Rance said. Then you'd better start riding. The 60 days became 90 when the mill contract came through for real. The 90 days became 6 months when Cord finally bought the north boundary strip for the price Rance had been asking for 2 years. Because Nora had written Cord a letter, explaining that the sale was happening one way or another, and the question was whether Cord got good land at a fair price, or Gideon Voss got it at a worse one. By the time the snow came down properly, the loan was paid. Nora learned about it from Ott, who rode in from Cutter's Creek on a Thursday with a receipt from the bank and the particular expression of a man delivering news he'd waited a long time to deliver. "Whitmore paid off Voss this morning," Ott said. "Full balance." I was there. She was in the middle of making bread and kept making it, but her hands shook slightly for the first minute after Ott told her, which was either relief or the cold, and she chose not to examine which. That evening Rance came in from the range later than usual. She had dinner on, and Ada was setting the table with the careful deliberateness that was her way, placing each fork like it mattered. And Eli was doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table with his tongue between his teeth. Rance stood in the doorway for a moment looking at all of it. The lamplight, the table, the smell of something warm, the ordinary fact of his children in his house. And Nora saw something in his face that she understood, because she'd felt it once or twice herself in the last weeks. The surprise of a life that had started to feel like living again. "It's paid," he said, to no one in particular. "I know," Nora said. "Ott told me. Sit down, dinner's ready." He sat. Ada brought him his fork with great ceremony. Eli looked up from his schoolwork long enough to say, "Ott said Voss was mad as a wet cat," which earned him a look from his father that he bore with magnificent dignity. It was an ordinary dinner. That was the point of it. The trouble with hinge points is that they work in both directions. A week after the loan was paid, a woman appeared at the ranch. She rode in alone, which was unusual, and she was well dressed for the territory, which was more unusual, and she asked for Rance by name, which made Nora's hands go still over the biscuit dough she was working. Her name was Helen Voss, Gideon's daughter. Nora didn't know this until later. What she knew, standing in the kitchen doorway, was that the woman was perhaps 35, handsome in a polished way, and that she looked at the house the way people look at houses they're considering purchasing. Rance spoke to her in the yard for 15 minutes. Nora watched from the kitchen window the way she'd watched the conversation with Gideon, and she told herself she was watching for the same reasons. Information gathering, hinge point monitoring. She was not watching because of the way Rance's posture shifted when the woman touched his arm, briefly, in a way that suggested a history Nora didn't know about. She told herself that too. That night, after the children were asleep, she asked. Not directly. She hadn't earned direct questions about his personal history. She said, "The woman who came today," she mentioned the Voss name. "Is she related to Gideon?" Rance was sharpening a knife at the kitchen table, the way he sometimes was in the evenings, and he looked up with an expression that said he'd been expecting this question and had hoped to avoid it. "His daughter," he said, "Helen. I knew her before I knew what her father was." "How well?" He set down the knife. "Well enough that when I borrowed the money, I thought Gideon Voss was extending a favor on account of his daughter, not setting a trap on account of his land." A pause. "I was wrong. Does she know what her father tried to do?" "She knows what her father does. Whether she understands it is a different question." He looked at Nora directly. "She wants to call on the children. She's known Eli and Ada since they were small." Nora thought about Ada watching from doorways, about Eli testing anyone who might leave before they had a chance to, about the way both of them had started, slowly, with difficulty, to act like children who expected the floor to hold their weight. "That's your decision," she said. "They're your children. I'm asking what you think." This surprised her. He didn't often ask what she thought about things that weren't accounts or livestock or the structural integrity of the back porch. "I think Ada doesn't need to be introduced to another person who might disappear," Nora said. "And I think you need to understand what Helen Voss wants before you let her get close to your children, because knowing her before isn't the same as knowing her now." Rance was quiet for a long time. "You're right. I'm usually right about accounts and people. Different skills, similar process." That surprised a sound out of him that might have been a laugh. She'd never heard him laugh before. It was a rough, brief thing, clearly out of practice, and it changed his face enough that she had to look away. Helen Voss came back twice. Both times Rance met her in the yard, and both times she left without coming inside. After the second visit, he told Nora that Helen had come to warn him. Gideon was not finished with the Whitmore ranch. "He doesn't like losing," Rance said. "Helen says he's talking to the county assessor about the property lines on the eastern pasture. Claims there's a surveying error that puts part of my land in question." "Is there?" "I don't know. The original survey was 20 years ago. If Gideon's got the assessor in his pocket, does he?" Rance looked at her. "In Cutter's Creek? Probably." Nora sat with that for a moment. She thought about Harlan Voss arriving at Iris's door with his folded paper and his borrowed sorrow. She thought about how the second problem always came right when you thought you'd solved the first one. "Do you have the original land deed?" she said. "Somewhere. Find it. Tonight if you can." She stood. "And tomorrow I'd like to go to Cutter's Creek." "For what?" "The county records office. Property disputes live and die in county records, and county records are public, which means Gideon Voss hasn't been able to change them yet. Only tamper with the people who interpret them." She met his eyes. "I'd like to see the original survey before anyone else decides what it says." He looked at her for a long moment. This was happening more often, him looking at her in a way that she couldn't categorize cleanly, that didn't fit into employer looking at employee or neighbor looking at neighbor. She wasn't sure what to do with it, so she looked back steadily until he dropped his eyes. "I'll hitch the wagon in the morning," he said. The county records office in Cutter's Creek was run by a man named Albright, who had the energy of someone counting the days until retirement and the memory of someone who'd never forget a face. He looked at Nora and Rance with the particular expression of a small-town official watching interesting weather move in from the west. Nora asked to see the original Whitmore land survey and the chain of title going back to the original grant. Albright pulled them without comment. She spread them on the counter and spent 45 minutes going through them, while Rance stood beside her and Albright pretended to do other paperwork. She found it on the third document, a notation in the margin of the 1871 survey, in handwriting different from the main text, that had been partially obscured by a water stain, or something that looked like a water stain. "Mr. Albright," she said pleasantly, "do you know what this notation says? I'm having trouble reading the handwriting." Albright came over and looked at it, and his expression changed very slightly in a way that confirmed her suspicion. "Hard to say," he said. "Water damage." "It came out unusually uniform for water damage," Nora said, equally pleasantly. "Water damage tends to bleed and blur. This looks more like it was applied deliberately." She looked at him. "I wonder if the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne would agree." Albright looked at the document. He looked at Nora. He looked at Rance, who was watching the whole exchange with his arms folded, and an expression that suggested he was following this carefully. "I'll need to log this document for review," Albright said after a moment. "That would be appropriate," Nora said. "I'd also like a certified copy of the original survey before we leave with today's date on the certification, as the record exists today." Albright made the copy. It took him an hour and he was not happy about it, but he made it, and Nora suspected he made it because whatever Gideon Voss was paying him for his cooperation didn't feel worth the alternative anymore. She filed a copy of the notation with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne by post that afternoon, with a letter describing the discrepancy and requesting an independent review. She didn't know if it would work. She knew it changed the calculation. Gideon Voss appeared at the ranch himself 10 days later, on a Sunday morning when the children were home. Rance saw him coming from half a mile out, the way you could in open country, and he came inside and looked at Nora without saying anything. "I know," she said. "Take the children to the barn." "Why?" "Because I don't know what he's going to do and I don't want them to see it." Nora looked at him. Then she called Eli and Ada and told them the gray mare needed brushing, and she'd promised them sugar cubes for it, and she took them out through the back door and down to the barn, while Rance went out to the yard. She settled the children with the mare and told them to make sure she got behind the ears, and then she went to the barn window where she could see the yard. Gideon Voss arrived with 4 men this time. He did not bother with any of the pretense he'd used on his previous visit. He said something to Rance that she couldn't hear clearly. Rance said something back. Voss's hand went to his coat. Nora had not planned what she did next. She decided later that this was probably why it worked. She walked out of the barn and across the yard with an unhurried, ordinary step, as if she were simply crossing to the house. She was carrying the account books, because she'd taken them from the house that morning to review the mill payments. "Mr. Voss," she said, in the same tone she'd have used to tell him supper was ready. "Your daughter was here last week. She seemed well." Gideon Voss turned to look at her. She'd learned by now that he was the kind of man who didn't know how to reckon with calm. Anger he expected, fear he preferred, calm confused him. "This doesn't concern you," he said. "Mr. Whitmore's accounts concern me. That's my employment." She held up the account books as if they were evidence of something, though they were only account books. "I've also been corresponding with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne about the survey discrepancy. They've been very responsive." She looked at him. Territorial land disputes have a way of becoming public record. Newspapers in Cheyenne find them interesting. It was not exactly a threat. Nora had learned, watching Iris deal with Harlan Voss across a shop counter, that the most useful weapon was the one that didn't look like a weapon. Gideon Voss studied her. He had his father's eyes, she realized. Or rather, Harlan had his brother's eyes. The same flat, cold calculation. "You're a housekeeper," he said. "I'm a woman with 12 years of account-keeping experience and a letter of introduction to the territorial newspaper editor in Cheyenne." She hadn't written such a letter. She'd thought of it 30 seconds ago. "Is there something I can help you with today?" One of Voss's men shifted his weight. Voss looked at Rance, then back at Nora, then at the account books, as if trying to determine what they actually contained. "This isn't finished," he said to Rance. "I expect not," Rance said. "But it's finished today." Voss rode out. His men followed. The yard went quiet with the particular silence of danger that has passed but not resolved. Nora stood in the yard with her account books until the dust settled. Then her hands started shaking and she let them, briefly, where only Rance could see. He stood beside her. He didn't say anything. After a moment his hand found hers, not holding it exactly. Just there, a brief and steadying presence. She let herself lean into it for 3 seconds. Then she straightened. "I should check on the children," she said. She stopped. He didn't have a sentence ready after her name. He seemed to be working on one, with difficulty, the way a man works on words when he's not used to needing them. "Thank you," he said finally. "For all of it, not just today." She turned to look at him. His face had the open, temporary quality it sometimes had in evenings when he thought no one was watching, before he remembered to put the caution back. "You've been paying me," she said. "That's not what I mean, I know." She met his eyes. "You're welcome." Winter settled in for real after that, and Gideon Voss did not come back. The Territorial Land Office sent an investigator who spent 2 days in Cutter's Creek and left with Albright looking considerably diminished. Helen Voss wrote Rance a letter that Nora didn't read, though she noticed it sat on his desk for several days before he answered it. She didn't ask what it said. It wasn't her business. She told herself this firmly and believed it most of the time. Ada began talking again in December. Not much, not easily, but words came back like water through a thaw, slow at first, then steadier. She said Nora's name one morning at breakfast. Just that Nora, pointing at the butter. And Eli immediately looked up from his food, with an expression that Nora had to turn away from because it was too much to look at directly. She was standing at the window after the children went to bed when Rance came to stand beside her. "Ada spoke today," he said. "At breakfast." "I know. I was there," the doctor said. "Time." He was right. They stood in the kitchen with the lamplight and the snow coming down outside, and the quiet of a house where children were sleeping. "My contract is through the end of January," Nora said, because the thought had been sitting at the back of her mind for a week and she'd found no better moment for it. Rance said nothing. "I wanted to raise it before then, to discuss what comes next." "What would you like to come next?" he said. His voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. Careful the way account figures are careful when you're trying not to commit to a number until you're certain. She turned from the window. He was watching her with the same open, temporary expression, and this time he didn't put the caution back. "I'd like to stay," she said, "if there's a reason to." The space between them was kitchen table width, and neither of them moved to close it. That was all right. There was time. "There's a reason," Rance said quietly, "if you want it." Outside, the snow came down on the eastern pasture, on the barn in better shape than the house, on the land that had nearly been taken and wasn't. Ada would talk more in the spring. Eli would destroy another pair of trousers. The mill contract would need to be renewed, and the cattle buyers would be slow with their payments, and all of it would need someone who was good with numbers and didn't back down from difficult men. Nora Callahan had $11 and an account book when she'd answered the advertisement. She had more than that now, though none of it could be written in a ledger. She thought of Iris, who had been a better housekeeper than accountant, and had paid for it. She thought of the boarding house with its empty kitchen and its borrowed sorrow. She thought of the promissory note that had started everything, and how some debts turned out to be investments in disguise, if you could endure the interest long enough. "Then I'd like it," she said. Rance let out a slow breath. Not relief exactly. The thing that comes after relief when you've stopped waiting to be disappointed. The snow kept falling. The lamp kept burning. And the kitchen, which had been a kitchen and nothing more, became something else. Not all at once, but the way most things worth having happen, in small and unremarkable moments that add up to a life.